The European Union has enacted some of the world's toughest data protection laws, but Ireland is preventing those laws from being put in place. Politico reveals this in an extensive investigation. It's called How One Country Blocks the World on Data Privacy. It reveals that Ireland, the EU's chief data protection enforcer, has not taken a single action against major tech firms such as Facebook and Google. Politico's technology editor, Nicholas Vinocour, wrote that article, and he joins me now from Brussels. So, Nicholas, give us a little bit of historical context here. Why is it that Ireland struggled to regulate big tech firms? What is it about that has really had big reverberations?
Well, what we have to understand is that Ireland's economy is very heavily dependent on foreign investment. And what the article tries to illustrate is an experience going back about 50 years where the Irish state essentially opened its arm to U.S. companies and said, come here, and we will pretty much make life easy for you. We'll give you very low taxes. We'll give you grants of money and lands to set up operations here, pretty much anything you want. And now we see some of the same pattern setting up around data regulation, where Ireland is ended up as the lead enforcer of these rules in Europe for these big Silicon Valley companies.
You know, what is it that what is really the European Union's general data protection regulation? Why do you think it is that Ireland is in charge of enforcing it?
So the general data protection regulation is a sweeping set of privacy laws, but it basically says some very simple things. It says, in order to collect your data, a company has to obtain your consent for that data. You have to explicitly give your approval to hand over your personal data. The second condition is when you hand over your data, it has to be for a specific purpose. So if I accept that a company is taking my data, I have to know that, well, that data will be used to sell advertising to me, or it will be used for research, medical research, or something like that. But there has to be an explicit purpose. It's a very powerful concept because it really goes against the business model of some of the biggest and most powerful companies, which gather a lot of data and then use that data to market all kinds of products and do things where they haven't asked for your explicit consent. And Ireland ended up in this position because the headquarters of so many of these U.S. companies are based in Ireland. They're there because they're great tax rules for the reasons I described before, and they control their data out of Ireland. And that's why Ireland ended up as the lead enforcer of these rules, which is a bit of an irony.
Yeah, it is a bit of an irony. And when you talk about the regulatory power, what have they really failed to do with that power?
Well, essentially, what we examined was the way Ireland was dealing with problems that had emerged over the last year. We've had no shortage of serious privacy scandals and violations since the GDPR came online in 2018. Just to cite a few, there have been questions about Google's location tracking services, where they followed you around on using your Android phone. There have been big breaches of privacy, for example, with Facebook, where people's personal information was compromised. And we looked at the action that Ireland took or didn't take on a lot of those questions. And what we found was, in general, at least so far, the jury's still out, but Ireland had never sanctioned one of these companies or even done something else that they could have done, which is to say, stop this practice, issue an enforcement order. It doesn't cost any money. There's no lawsuit involved. But Ireland didn't take that step. And for me, and for what our investigation suggested, is that enforcing these rules and sanctioning these companies puts Ireland in a conflict of interest.
You write about the relationship between the former Irish Prime Minister and also Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. We know that when it comes to regulation, relationships matter. There are lobbyists on Capitol Hill. These relationships have some impact. Why was that relationship in Ireland such an important factor to really understanding Ireland's failures in enforcing these regulations?
Well, I don't want to make any assertions that I can't back up. But what we can say is that as soon as Facebook knew these privacy rules were coming down the pipe, they took a very close interest in the person who would be enforcing the regulation. They knew that Ireland would end up being the lead country in enforcing it, and they wanted to have a say, or at least make their position known on what sort of person should be running the regulation. And so Sheryl Sandberg met with the Irish Prime Minister in several locales in Davos, Switzerland, on the sidelines of a gathering of global leaders, in the headquarters of Facebook, and pushing a clear message. They said, we want someone who is a regulator like the previous regulators. And if you make the wrong choice, they didn't say this explicitly, but it was the subtext. If you make the wrong choice, we will reconsider our investment in the European Union and in Ireland. Now, for a country of 4.7 million people, which the economy is 10% of the economy, is reliant on jobs and revenue from U.S. tech companies, that's a very powerful message. And the person they chose is an Irish civil servant with no background in law enforcement or investigations, who's done a good job in terms of setting up the agency, but she's not an investigator. She's not a prosecutor. So, yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting to hear. Tell me a little bit more about her.
Helen Dixon was chosen supposedly at the end of an open recruitment process, but what I underline in the piece is that they did not go and write an ad and say, "Are you a federal prosecutor with experience at investigating complex white-collar crimes? Come and take this enormous responsibility in Ireland." They chose an Irish civil servant who had been inside the government apparatus, who'd worked for a U.S. tech company, who understood all this cozy relationship between the companies and the government to run the regulation there and enforce these rules, not just on behalf of Ireland, but on behalf of 500 million Europeans, and setting standards in privacy for the whole world. And that's what I say to people who've been calling and criticizing the article from Ireland. They are not the regulator for Ireland. They are the regulator for all of the European Union, and they are representing standards that should be the best standards worldwide in terms of privacy.
Thank you, Nicholas, so much for joining us. Nicholas Vinokour, we appreciate your time. I want to bring in CNET senior producer Dan Patterson, who joins us now. Dan, you just heard from Nicholas. What's your reaction to his reporting?
Well, this story is a powerful reminder, Rena, that regulation is not just a clean check mark that we can scratch off the list, especially with stories as complicated and nuanced as technology and the way it's woven throughout our lives. Look, this is a really hard job enforcing the regulation, but as we pointed out in the segment a moment ago, it is Ireland's job to enforce this for all of the EU. We can use that as kind of a template to look at what may be coming for the United States.
I want to talk to you about that. Is there anything that Ireland, when you look at what Ireland has done and has not done, is there any impact on the U.S.?
Well, we can use it as a kind of precedent setting, or at least as a template. So these companies are so large that really regulating them is something that requires nuance and an understanding that, hey, look, your data privacy is something that is not yours to be exploited by another companies. It is yours. It is something that you can control. And so what we saw with the GDPR, which was kind of a carrot and a stick, there are incentives built into the GDPR as well, but that your data is something that should be in your possession. And what Ireland has done is kind of counter to that notion.
When we talk about Cambridge Analytica, we do lots of stories on that. Does this story with Ireland have any implications with the Cambridge Analytica story?
Well, what it does is kind of set up this split between your data being something that is in the possession of other companies that helped you generate it, versus something that is yours. Think about your social security number. Yes, the United States government helped you acquire this number, but this number is something that uniquely identifies you as well as your activity throughout the financial system in the United States. Your data privacy is much like your social security number. It's inherently attached to who you are. So when when companies allow your data to be exploited by private companies, Cambridge Analytica might be an example of that, you are not simply an entity within the Facebook system and therefore controlled by Facebook. You are your own sovereign entity, and to allow other companies to have access to that, what this regulation is kind of saying is that there needs to be some sort of process where you are fully aware of what you are giving up and how it could be used now and in the future.
When you talk about regulation in the U.S., are you hopeful that there'll be any changes here?
Well, I think that we will see some sort of policies enacted in the next 18 months or so. But really what we need to pay attention to is how those policies are enacted. You know, regulating a self-driving car is not the same thing as regulating, say, the Facebook newsfeed algorithm. And we need to make sure that we have policymakers that are as up to speed on not just the technological advances of today, but how technology advances quickly, and so that they can be able to differentiate in legislation self-driving car AI and the technologies that power that are not the same thing as your personal data.
Dan Patterson, thank you for joining us.